Hello, everyone. Welcome to Latter-day Struggles. This is your host, Valerie, and I have Nathan here with me. Hi, Nate.
Hello. Good to be back.
It is good to be here with all of you today. We are beginning a three-part series here on Latter-day Struggles 2.0, Transcending and Including Mormonism, where what we're going to dive into is an exploration of 4 different kinds of engagement with spirituality. Okay, so just as a little bit of a heads up before we jump deeply into this series, this is a complex topic, somewhat messy, and I think you're going to enjoy it, in part because it's just like really interesting, like all of the other things that I think we talk about, but also we've gotten some feedback that you all like when we sort of wrestle right alongside with you. And what we have decided to do, not because, well, it's somewhat strategic, but it's also because as Nathan and I study these topics together, we kind of come up with our own questions and like, how about this? And what do you think about that? And so we're actually working through this ourselves as we go. So our hope is that maybe we're just a tiny bit ahead of you, but only maybe just a tiny bit, which kind of makes it fun, right? Because this is like, to me, I mean, I could be wrong on this, but I'm not convinced there's anyone else in Mormon discourse talking about what you and I talk about here on Latter-day Struggles when we talk about this kind of philosophy meets spirituality at these deepening levels of kind of like higher or deeper levels of spiritual engagement. That's what you and I do here. And so we give ourselves lots and lots of grace that we are not experts by any stretch of the imagination. And we're certainly not experts when it comes to Mormonism because we've never heard anybody else talk about this. Anything you want to say as we jump in, Nathan?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. To say that we're wrestling and learning as we go is really important, right? Because some of the things we talk about today, we may have different opinions 12 months from now when we have grown ourselves. And so all conclusions are held provisionally, is one of my favorite quotes from Anthony DeMello. Belief is, first and foremost, becomes a fear management system. It's a good starting point for kids, but when we get into adulthood, we tend to hold on to it because of a fear management program.
Belief matters more than embodiment. Belief matters more than actually how one lives one's life. And then that leads people to feel as if no matter who they are or who others are, that making sure that one's own beliefs and others' beliefs are in check is existentially the most important thing.
Sometimes we become obsessed with people believing the right way because we sincerely have bought into this fear-based version of God, that our beliefs is what saves us.
Your beliefs become basically like your insurance policy, that if you believe and if others that you love believe the right way, then you will receive eternal life. Okay, so it is basically the way you manage your anxiety, and therefore the beliefs become the insurance policy.
Faith is a way of intuiting how to bring in those core principles that we believe are rooted in spirit or God or goodness or whatever you are sensing, without defining the individual laws about how that has to play out in order for it to be right and for God to recognize that your goodness is playing out in the correct way.
As soon as one enters into this place of faith, where you have these two systems kind of bumping into each other, right? I'm starting to sort of expand who gets into heaven, and it may even include people that don't believe the same way as I do. So what we're doing is we're actually growing, but it starts to feel really, really scary because our paradigms are starting to break down.
We all have probably seen in our lives examples of people who wrestled with difficult subjects and ended up reverting back to burying themselves in beliefs according to their earlier stage of development as a way to protect themselves from the pain associated with paradox.
That, to me, my friends, is where real growth happens. And I'm emotionally equilibrated enough to be challenged by my existing framework, but not too challenged to where I have a panic attack about it.
These peak experiences, what we would call in the LDS culture spiritual experiences, are these direct feelings. And when we have those experiences, we are taught to interpret their meaning through the lens of our current level of spiritual development.
Depending on where we are developmentally, the questions even change. And I think
Yes.
also it has to do with how we are conditioned or taught in our early stage belief phase, how we were even taught to engage with this thing that is God, right? That then led me to have everyday experiences that showed me that I could have more confidence to trust in myself. And I will tell you that my experiences that changed me for the most part personally was thousands of hours in the counseling room, where what used to be very easily judged by, hearkening back to my beliefs without any access to firsthand experiences with people changed when I sat with people and I saw the goodness and lovability of every single human being that I sat before. And I could understand the nature of their suffering and how they got to where they were, wherever they were, and with whatever they were struggling with. And I just, my judgment machine broke. I couldn't judge people anymore. And I began to have experiences where I saw the divine in every single human being. And then I started having the courage and the capacity to look more deeply and to critically think about all of the structures of my earlier beliefs, which is a good thing. And it doesn't mean that it isn't a valuable thing to have those beliefs in the first place. And each and every one of these things accumulate and build upon one another to where each and every one of us has the capacity to then move into, and I don't think this is it never ends, that I think we all have the capacity to continue to build upon our experiences to where we are adapting to becoming more and more awake to our always and already divinity. And my hope is that what you're experiencing as you listen to this is this very thing also unfolding in you in ways that you probably aren't even really aware of. So hopefully maybe this will give you a sense of a way to reflect upon who you are and how far you've come and the beautiful things that you are realizing and discovering and unfolding within each of you. Anything you want to say as we close today, Hen?
That's beautiful. I don't want to touch it.
All right. So grateful to have all of you with me and Nathan. Thank you so much for being our companions here on Latter-day Struggles, especially Latter-day Struggles 2.0. If this is something that is meaningful for you, I opened up the live fellowship just especially because, to be honest, I selfishly just want to talk to you all. I want to have some conversations with each of you and hear how these things are landing, how you're growing, and how these ideas are impacting you. So if this calls to you, I'd love to see you there. Thanks for being with me, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Latter-day Struggles. If this podcast has supported your faith journey, we invite you to explore the many ways you can continue your healing and growth with us. On our website, you'll find support and processing groups, marriage and parenting courses, and free resources to support where you are in your faith journey. You can also join Valerie in the live fellowship gatherings throughout the year, where we connect, process the podcast, and build meaningful friendships with others on similar paths. If cost has ever been a barrier, we offer podcast scholarships funded by listener donations. To explore all of these offerings, visit the link in today's show notes or go to latterdaystruggles.com. And if this podcast has been meaningful to you, leaving a 5-star review is one of the most powerful ways to help others find this work. Latter-day Struggles is proud to be part of the Dialogue Podcast Network.
Dialogue Podcast Network.